Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that has shaped human survival since the very beginning. Food, and more specifically how people kept it from spoiling long before the modern convenience of refrigeration. So before you let yourself drift off, settle in, get comfortable, dim the lights, and listen as we unfold the quiet history of food preservation. Imagine the earliest humans, long before cities, before writing, before even the thought of civilization as we know it. They faced the same problem that you and I would face if stranded without power today. You kill an animal. You gather fruits and roots. You harvest grain. But what happens the next day? And the next? When the meat begins to turn. When the berries soften and rot. When hunger does not go away but the food does. The answer was the earliest methods of preservation. Methods born not of science at first, but of simple observation and necessity. Let's begin with drying. Probably the oldest method of all. Meat laid out in the sun. Strips of fish hung in dry wind. Fruit sliced and placed on warm rocks. This was not complicated technology, but it was effective. Removing moisture slowed the growth of the invisible organisms that spoiled food. And though those people did not know of bacteria or yeast, they knew that dried food lasted. They knew that smoke and wind and sun worked better than doing nothing. Across the world this method appeared again and again. In Africa, fish were dried under the relentless heat of the sun. In the Americas, bison was cut into thin sheets and dried into something like jerky. In Asia, rice farmers dried their harvest in the open air to carry through the monsoon months. Everywhere, the principle was the same. Less water meant longer survival. It is easy to overlook just how profound this was. A strip of dried meat could travel days or weeks. A pouch of dried fruit could feed children through a lean season. Entire migrations depended on food that did not rot in 3 days. The technique was simple, but the consequences were enormous. The second method emerged almost accidentally: fermentation. Wild yeast and bacteria changed foods into something different. Milk forgotten in a container thickened into yogurt. Grape juice left out too long became wine. Cabbage buried underground began to sour. For early people this might have seemed like a kind of transformation, even magic. But it offered two gifts: flavor and preservation. Fermented foods lasted longer. And they also became staples of culture. Korean kimchi, Middle Eastern cheese, African sorghum beer. Each of these was at first a survival tactic. Later, they became identity, tradition, even ritual. When you think of food preservation, it is not only about avoiding hunger. It is about shaping taste, shaping culture itself. But there were limits. Drying required sun or fire. Fermentation required time and luck. In colder climates, another method became important: freezing and cold storage. Nature itself provided the solution. In the far north, meat left outside in the snow could last through the winter. Ice and frost became natural allies. People in northern Europe stored fish in icy cellars. Nomadic peoples on the Siberian steppe buried meat in frozen ground. This was refrigeration, thousands of years before the refrigerator. In fact, harvesting ice was a common practice even in warmer lands when it could be found. Ancient Chinese records describe ice houses used as early as the 2nd millennium BCE. Blocks of winter ice cut and packed into underground chambers, insulated with straw or sawdust, kept food and drink cool well into the summer months. Persians built remarkable cone-shaped structures called yakshals, mud brick ice houses that could preserve frozen water through blazing desert heat. It is hard not to admire that ingenuity, to keep coolness alive in the hottest places on Earth. And then there was smoking, a cousin to drying, but enhanced with fire. Meat or fish suspended above slow coals, absorbing compounds from the smoke that inhibited bacteria. It preserved, and it flavored. The smoked hams of Europe, the smoked salmon of indigenous North Americans, the smoky teas of Asia, all carry within them this dual history of necessity and taste. Over time, these methods combined and adapted. A piece of fish might be salted, then dried, then smoked. Grains might be dried, then fermented into beer. Cheese could be salted, aged, even smoked again. Preservation was not a single trick. It was a layered set of tools, each chosen depending on season, climate, and need. And here is where the story turns slightly toward reflection. Today, we live with refrigerators and freezers humming quietly in our kitchens. We shop at stores where food from across the globe waits in neat packages. We hardly pause to think about rot or scarcity. But for most of human history, preservation was survival. To forget food was to risk hunger. To know how to keep it was power. Imagine living in a world where a failed harvest was not an inconvenience, but a crisis. Where storing grain through a long winter could mean life or death for an entire village. Where a salt trade could fund empires. Or where an ice block cut in January might be worth gold in July. As we drift through these ideas, you can see how food preservation was more than technique. It was civilization itself. Because with preservation came stability. With stability came cities. With cities came culture. Tonight we have only begun with the earliest forms. Drying in the sun. Fermenting by accident. Smoking over fire. Storing in cold. Each was a step in humanity's long attempt to outwit time and decay. In the next part we will move forward to explore how salt, that simplest of minerals, shaped preservation. And through it, trade, wealth, and entire kingdoms. But for now, let the thought linger that every bite of food you eat today is the heir of countless generations of trial and error. That every preserved flavor, jerky, wine, cheese, kimchi, all of it, comes from this ancient story of survival. Tonight we continue the quiet story of how people preserved food before refrigeration. And we arrive at a substance so ordinary on our tables today, that it almost disappears from notice. Salt. For much of history it was not ordinary at all. It was rare. It was fought over. It was taxed. And it preserved life in more ways than one. Imagine a world before modern packaging. Before canned goods. Before frozen aisles. Meat would spoil within days. Fish within hours. Vegetables would soften and collapse into waste. But with salt, all of these could last. Salt draws out moisture. And in doing so it slows the invisible growth of decay. It turns vulnerable flesh into something resilient. Meat into jerky. Fish into stockfish. Cabbage into sauerkraut. Salt was not only flavor. It was preservation. And so it became a foundation of trade and empire. In ancient Egypt, salted fish and meat were carried along the Nile to feed workers who built monuments of stone. Salted duck and goose were stored in pottery jars sealed with fat. For the living it meant survival. For the dead it meant eternity. The process of mummification was itself a preservation by salt. Natron drying the body to resist decay. A cultural echo of the same principle used on food. In China, records tell of salted meats as early as the first dynasties. Armies on campaign marched with barrels of preserved fish and pork. Rice could be salted and stored against famine. The mineral became so valued that governments guarded its production. A monopoly that brought steady revenue to dynasties across centuries. The Roman world too was built on salt. Legions required preserved food to move across Europe and beyond. Pork cured with salt sustained campaigns far from home. Roads were built for its transport. The Via Salaria, the salt road leading into Rome itself. The very word salary comes from salt. A reminder that pay for soldiers and workers was often measured in this essential mineral. In medieval Europe, salt was the foundation of whole economies. The herring trade in the north. Anchovies in the Mediterranean. Beef packed in barrels in the Low Countries. All depended on vast amounts of salt. Towns rose near salt mines and salt pans. Lüneburg in Germany owed its wealth to salt. Venice controlled salt routes across the Adriatic. The mineral was wealth in crystalline form. In Africa, caravans of camels carried blocks of salt across the Sahara. From Tagaza to Timbuktu, trading them ounce for ounce with gold. Salt was not only preservation but currency itself. To possess it meant to command survival in climates where food rotted in days. The Middle East carried salt deeper into science and craft. Cheese, olives, and cured meats shaped diets across centuries. In Islamic medical texts, salt was praised as purifier and protector. It traveled with merchants through deserts and seas, woven into the very pattern of civilization. Even in the Americas, salt appeared in varied forms. Indigenous peoples along the coasts harvested sea salt for fish preservation. Inland groups boiled brine springs. And in the Andes, salted meat known as charqui kept highland communities alive through harsh winters. A practice that still echoes in the word jerky today. Consider for a moment the way salt defined landscapes. Wherever it could be mined or evaporated, settlements thrived. And where it was absent, people traveled great distances to secure it. This was more than a seasoning. This was survival measured in crystals. And yet, with all its importance, salt was not limitless. Governments taxed it heavily. In France, the gabelle, a salt tax so burdensome it helped fuel revolution. In China, dynastic monopolies on salt could make or break treasuries. Wars were fought for control of saltworks. Rebellions sparked when its supply was choked. From a modern view, it is almost unimaginable. We think of salt as inexpensive, always present on tables, hidden in nearly every processed food, so abundant that health warnings now urge us to consume less. But for most of human history, to have salt was to have stability. Without it, food spoiled. Without it, armies starved. Without it, trade faltered. And so the story of salt is also the story of how civilizations extended themselves beyond the limits of immediate harvest. How armies could march. How cities could be fed. How food could be carried from one season to the next. It was not glamorous. It was not rare like spices or silk. But it was more essential than either. Today, when you sprinkle a pinch over a meal, you are performing the last step of a tradition that once shaped empires. You are echoing millennia of preservation. And though refrigeration has replaced its daily necessity, salt still lives at the core of food, curing meats, fermenting vegetables. Even in our kitchens of stainless steel and humming freezers, we remain tied to this mineral as firmly as the ancients. And so, as the night deepens, we leave salt for now, the quiet mineral that guarded food through ages. And in the next part, we will step into the smoky air of fire itself, to see how wood and flame gave another layer of protection, and another layer of taste. Tonight, we move deeper into the history of food preservation, and we arrive at fire, the element that humanity mastered so early, yet never fully ceased to depend on. Fire cooked food. It offered warmth. It kept predators away. But it also did something quieter. Something longer lasting. It preserved. Imagine an early hunter, returning with meat from a successful hunt. The tribe gathers near the flames, and in the glow of firelight strips of meat are hung near the smoke. Not directly on the flame, but close enough to dry slowly, absorbing the bitter tang of wood and ash. In the morning, the strips are tougher, less perishable. They can be carried farther, and eaten days later without illness. This was smoking in its earliest form. An accident perhaps. A discovery made again and again by different peoples in different places. But once known, it never left the human toolkit. Smoking worked by doing more than one thing. The heat dried the food, reducing the moisture where bacteria thrive. The smoke itself carried compounds, phenols and acids, that inhibited decay. And the constant exposure to low heat killed off what might grow otherwise. In short, smoking was preservation by layers, a belt of protection woven by fire. Across the world, this practice took shape. In northern Europe, salmon was smoked for long winters. In the forests of North America, deer meat and fish were hung in tall smoking racks. In the islands of the Pacific, fish and coconut were smoked above smoldering fires of palm fronds. In each place, the wood itself shaped the taste. Oak gave one note, alder another, applewood a sweetness, preservation and flavor together. In Scandinavia, smoked fish became a staple. Preserved herring and salmon fed villages through months of snow. The tradition carried into medieval trade. Smoked fish traveled from coastal towns deep inland, feeding markets hundreds of miles away. Without smoking, these journeys would have been impossible. In Eastern Europe, smoked sausages became a symbol of durability. Made from pork, seasoned, packed into casings, then hung above smokehouses. They lasted weeks or months. A portable protein source for peasants and soldiers alike. Smoke here was not only a technique. It was cultural identity. Festivals, feasts, and winters alike all bore its flavor. Further east in China and Japan, smoking became part of more elaborate preservation. Duck cured with salt, then smoked over fruitwoods. Fish fillets dried and smoked until hard enough to shave into thin flakes. These were not only for storage, but for trade. Delicacies that traveled along routes of commerce, feeding emperors and commoners alike. Among indigenous peoples of North America, smoking took monumental forms. The smokehouse was central to survival. Huge racks of salmon or venison dried slowly in controlled smoke. This allowed entire communities to carry food into the lean months. Without it, winter would have brought hunger. With it, food security became possible. Smoking was often combined with other methods. Meat salted before smoking lasted even longer. Fish dried slightly, then smoked held its texture. Cheese could be smoked after fermentation to carry it through seasons. And so we see that preservation was rarely one single step, but a layering of defenses, a shield against time. In Africa as well, smoking was common. Fish pulled from rivers, smoked over long fires, kept edible through the scorching heat of dry seasons. In West Africa, smoked catfish remains a staple today, a reminder of how old these methods are, carried forward almost unchanged into the present. Smoke also carried symbolism. The act of hanging food above a fire was more than chemistry. It was ritual, a visible sign of turning perishable flesh into durable sustenance. In some cultures, smoke itself was purification, warding off invisible dangers, a kind of offering to both body and spirit. In medieval Europe, smokehouses became important architecture. Small huts built with slits for controlled airflow. Families hung sausages, bacon, and fish inside. And the scent of smoke became the scent of security. Every curl of smoke rising into the air was a promise that food was safe, a quiet assurance against hunger. And as centuries passed, the technique became refined. Low and slow smoking for preservation. Hotter smoking for quicker cooking. Spices added for layered taste. The preservation aspect began to merge with culinary pleasure. The line between necessity and choice blurred. Today we often think of smoked foods as luxuries. Smoked salmon on a table. Smoked cheeses. Smoked teas. Flavors pursued deliberately rather than accepted as survival. Yet beneath each delicate slice lies the ancient logic. Fire against rot. Smoke against spoilage. Modern food science tells us what our ancestors could not name. That compounds in smoke act as antimicrobials. That reduced oxygen slows bacterial growth. That temperature and humidity balance matters. But long before the vocabulary of science, people understood through experience. Food left in smoke endured. Food without it did not. Reflect for a moment on the rhythm of this history. Smoke rising from a hut in medieval Europe. Smoke drifting through forests where fish were hung to dry. Smoke coiling in Pacific islands around palmwood fires. All telling the same story in different accents. That humanity leaned on fire not just for warmth and cooking, but for survival across days and seasons. Today, refrigeration has replaced smoke as our guard against spoilage. Yet we still return to it. Not because we need to, but because the taste has become heritage. Barbecue, smoked meats, teas, cheeses, all echo a preservation method that once kept whole communities alive. There is something grounding in this continuity, a reminder that technology may change, but culture remembers, and the food we enjoy today still carries whispers of the past. In the next part of this unfolding story, we will turn to another form of preservation, one that often worked side by side with smoking, drying not by sun or flame alone, but by wind and air, methods that transformed grains, fruits, and meats into durable stores of energy. A quieter preservation than fire, but no less important. For tonight we close on smoke. on the image of food suspended in fragrant air, on fire used not only to cook but to protect, a thin veil between humanity and hunger, woven in ash and flame. We have spoken of fire, and the way smoke guarded food from decay. But not all preservation required flame. Sometimes the gentlest forces were enough. The air itself, the steady pull of wind, the slow patience of time. Drying is perhaps the oldest method of all. Older even than salt. Older than smoke. It was as simple as leaving food out in the open, on rocks warmed by the sun, on mats woven of reeds, on racks lifted above the ground, and watching as the moisture slipped away, transforming tender flesh into something tough, but lasting. Air drying worked because bacteria need water. Without it they cannot spread. And so a strip of meat or a cluster of fruit becomes inhospitable to decay, shrinking, darkening, but surviving long beyond its natural span. Across continents this practice arose independently. In Africa strips of game were dried under relentless sun. In the Americas bison meat was sliced thin and dried in open air, forming what we know today as jerky. In Asia fish and rice were spread across mats, left to dry in wind before storage. Each culture found the same truth, that air could be a tool, that time itself could be harnessed. In Europe dried fruits became staples, grapes transformed into raisins, figs into leathery stores of sweetness, apples sliced and dried to feed families through long winters. Grain too was dried, sometimes in kilns, sometimes simply spread across courtyards, to ensure that dampness would not rot the harvest in storage. Air drying required care. Too much moisture in the air, and the food spoiled. Too much heat, and it cooked instead of preserved. Too little airflow, and mold appeared. So knowledge grew slowly, an understanding of seasons, of weather, of where to hang and when to gather. Among the Andean peoples of South America a remarkable method emerged. They created chuno, potatoes dried in the icy air of high altitudes, exposed to frost at night and sun by day, trampled to squeeze out moisture, and left again to the elements. The result was a lightweight, durable food, capable of lasting for years, a foundation for Inca armies and communities. And even today chuno remains part of Andean diets. In the Middle East and Central Asia dried foods were equally vital. Apricots dried in desert air, dates harvested and sun-dried until dense with sweetness. Yogurt itself could be dried into hard cakes, pounded and carried by nomads, reconstituted with water when needed. These were foods shaped by air, shaped by climate, shaped by necessity. In Japan bonito fish were dried until rock-hard, katsubushi, shaved into delicate flakes for cooking. But beneath the flavor lay preservation. Fish transformed by drying into something that could be kept indefinitely, an ingredient born of the simple act of air and time. Air drying also shaped cultural taste. The chewy texture of dried meat, the concentrated sweetness of dried fruit, the tang of dried fish. These became familiar, comforting even. Flavors tied to survival but also to memory. When we think of dried food today, we may imagine camping supplies, fruit leather, trail mix, lightweight and portable. But for millennia it was not a convenience. It was the boundary between hunger and survival. A family with dried apples or dried meat could last the winter. A family without them faced emptiness. Drying also allowed travel. Merchants could carry foods across deserts and mountains. Armies could march with rations that did not spoil in days. Pilgrims and nomads alike packed dried stores for journeys that stretched across weeks. Without air drying, movement itself would have been narrower, civilization less connected. Air drying had its limits. It worked best in certain climates, dry, windy, and predictable. In humid lands it faltered, and so people turned to other methods. Salting, smoking, fermenting. But even their air played its role, aided by those other defenses. Working together. Consider for a moment the silence of air drying. No smoke, no flame, only the whisper of wind. and the slow shift of food changing texture. A transformation almost invisible, yet essential. This was preservation at its most patient. Modern technology has not abandoned the principle. Today we use dehydrators and freeze-drying machines. We package dried fruit in plastic. We sell jerky in neat foil bags. We freeze-dry coffee to carry flavor across oceans. But the heart of the process is the same. Removing water, leaving behind something resilient, something able to last. The difference is scale. Where once families laid strips of meat on rooftops, now factories dry foods by the ton. But the logic is unchanged. Air and absence of water guard food from time. There is a strange continuity in this. That as modern as we imagine ourselves. Our food still relies on ancient methods. That the raisins in a child's lunchbox, the dried pasta on a pantry shelf, are echoes of decisions made thousands of years ago. Decisions to trust the air, to let the wind preserve. As you reflect on this, imagine again those earliest scenes. A woman spreading fruit on a mat beneath the sun. A hunter hanging strips of meat on a rack. A farmer turning grain with a wooden rake. All trusting that air would do what fire and salt could not. That in stillness and patience food would endure. In the next part we will turn to the ground itself. To storage in earth, in cellars, in ice. Methods of preservation not by altering the food, but by controlling its environment. Nature as vault. Soil, stone, and cold air as guardians against decay. For now, we leave with the quiet presence of air. Invisible yet constant. A reminder that preservation need not always be violent or dramatic. Sometimes it is as simple as breathing space, as waiting, as letting wind and time perform their silent work. So far we have followed the thread of preservation through salt, through smoke, through air and sun. But sometimes survival required not changing the food itself, but hiding it away, tucking it into the earth, letting soil, stone, and ice guard it from time. From the earliest days people noticed that cool places slowed decay. Meat lasted longer when buried in snow. Roots kept firm when hidden in pits. Grain endured when stored deep in clay jars underground. This was not science as we would name it today. It was observation. A careful learning of the Earth's own rhythms. Imagine a prehistoric community, gathering tubers and nuts, digging shallow pits lined with leaves, covering them with soil and stones, returning weeks later to find the food still edible. These were the first root cellars. Simple, effective, and endlessly adaptable. The logic was plain. Underground the temperature is more stable, cooler in summer, warmer in winter, protected from sudden change, and protected too from the eyes of animals or raiders. The earth became a vault, its currency survival. As societies grew, these pits became more elaborate. In Europe, farmers dug deep root cellars, stone-lined rooms beneath houses or barns, where potatoes, carrots, cabbages, and apples could last through long winters. In cold climates, these cellars were essential. They meant fresh produce months after harvest. They meant stability in seasons of scarcity. In ancient China, storage pits were used to preserve grain. Clay jars sealed with wax or oil buried beneath earth, ensuring that the harvest did not vanish to damp or pests. The principle was so important that entire bureaucracies rose to manage grain storage. Granaries were the backbone of dynasties. Tax collected in grain, stored underground, feeding soldiers and citizens through lean years. The Middle East and Central Asia saw similar ingenuity. In Persia, the yakchal, towering conical ice houses, built of thick mud brick with subterranean chambers, collected ice during winter, and preserved it well into the blazing summers. Straw and clay acted as insulation. Vents allowed hot air to escape. Within, food and water remained cool. Centuries before mechanical refrigeration, a marvel of design born from necessity. In the Mediterranean, underground storage shaped trade. Olive oil stored in sealed amphorae, buried partly in earth or stacked in cool stone warehouses. Wine too preserved not by altering but by storing. Cellars dug beneath villas. Caves pressed into hillsides. The earth not only preserved the drink, but matured it, turning preservation into refinement. In northern Europe, ice houses became common by the 17th century. Blocks of ice cut from rivers in winter, packed in straw, buried in underground chambers. They lasted for months, chilling butter, preserving meat, a luxury at first for the wealthy, but gradually spreading. An early step toward the refrigerators we know today. Indigenous peoples too turned to the ground. The Inuit of the Arctic stored fish and whale meat in pits carved into permafrost. Natural freezers in frozen soil. In North America, native groups buried corn in deep pits, lined with grass and bark, sealed against moisture. In Africa, underground granaries protected millet and sorghum from insects and heat. From desert to tundra, the principle was the same. The earth as shield. The use of caves was especially widespread. In southern France, caves stored cheeses. The constant temperature and humidity turning milk into durable wheels. In Italy, prosciutto and hams aged in cool stone cellars. Not only preserved but transformed into delicacies. What began as survival became culture. Consider the symbolic weight of this method. To place food in the ground is to trust the earth itself. To bury sustenance as though planting, and to retrieve it later as though harvesting again. A cycle of concealment and return. The land as both field and vault. Modern reflections show how little has changed in essence. Many of us still keep cellars or pantries. Wine stored in cool basements. Vegetables kept in root cellars even today. Cheeses aged in caves not for necessity, but for flavor. The methods are ancient. The context has shifted, but the principle remains. This type of preservation also shaped economies and power. Kings and rulers controlled granaries. The ability to store food determined who could endure famine, who could wage war, who could build cities. Grain stored underground was wealth. Grain spoiled was ruin. When refrigeration arrived in the 19th and 20th centuries, it replaced many of these methods, but not completely. Even now, ice houses still exist in parts of Iran. Root cellars remain in rural communities, and the flavor of cave-aged cheeses is prized above industrial alternatives, because earth and stone give qualities that machinery cannot fully mimic. Think too of the continuity across millennia. From a Neolithic pit of roots to a Victorian ice house. From a Persian yakshal to a modern wine cellar. The story is unbroken. Humans turning to the ground, to the silence beneath their feet, to keep food safe from time. In the next part of this unfolding story, we will shift again, from earth to transformation, to the alchemy of fermentation. How milk, grains, vegetables, and even fish became altered by microbes, turned sour or alcoholic, and in that sourness, found endurance. But for tonight, let the image linger of food buried in cool earth. Grain sealed in jars, ice resting under straw, a quiet partnership between humanity and soil, where survival lay not in battle or fire, but in patience, in trust, in the ground itself. Until now we have spoken of preservation as a fight against decay, salt holding rot at bay, smoke sealing meat from insects, cellars hiding roots in steady darkness. But another path emerged, a paradox. Instead of resisting change, people invited it. Fermentation is controlled spoilage, or rather, a bargain struck with invisible forces. Bacteria, yeasts, molds, all organisms too small to see, yet powerful enough to reshape what we eat, and keep it safe far longer than it would survive alone. The earliest evidence of fermentation is older than writing. Archaeologists in China uncovered 9,000-year-old pottery jars, once filled with a mixture of rice, honey, and fruit, fermented into an early form of alcohol. In the Caucasus, wine was fermenting by 6000 BCE. In the Fertile Crescent, barley became beer. What began as preservation of sugars soon became ritual, celebration, culture. Milk too found new life through microbes. In the hot pastures of the Middle East and Central Asia, fresh milk spoiled quickly, so herders learned to let it ferment. soured into yogurt or kefir, easier to digest, longer to keep, a transformation that carried survival in its tang. Cheese grew from this same necessity, milk curdled, curds pressed, aged in caves or wrapped in leaves. Suddenly the fleeting became durable, protein stored not for hours but for months, sometimes for years. And with that durability came flavor. Flavors that defined regions. Parmesan from Parma, Roquefort from its caves, Gouda from Dutch markets. Cheese was preservation made delicious. Fermentation also saved vegetables. Cabbage turned to sauerkraut in Europe, kimchi in Korea, pickled mustard greens in China. These jars of sour crunch carried vitamins through winters when fresh greens vanished. They kept sailors alive at sea. They kept farmers nourished through long snows. Acid as shield, taste as bonus. Fish too could ferment. In Scandinavia, herring became surströmming. In Southeast Asia, anchovies transformed into fish sauce. In Japan, bonito and soybeans fermented together into miso. In every case, the smell was strong, sometimes overpowering, but beneath the pungency was safety. Proteins broken down, flavors intensified. Food kept far beyond its natural span. Cereals also found their way into fermentation. Bread made from grains was fragile, quick to mold. But if the same grains were brewed, they became beer. And beer could be stored and transported, providing calories and safe hydration when water was uncertain. In medieval Europe, beer was not indulgence but necessity. Children drank it. Laborious relied on it. It was food, liquid bread, born from fermentation. This process was mysterious to ancient people. They did not know the names of yeast or lactobacillus, but they recognized patterns. A bubbling jar meant life. A sour tang meant safety. Cultures developed rituals around these transformations. Fermentation became wrapped in myth and religion. Egyptians offered beer to the gods. Chinese poets praised the wine jar. Monks in Europe perfected ales. A practical science without microscopes. Knowledge passed by taste and trial, rather than written law. The beauty of fermentation is that it turned fragility into resilience. Grapes rot in days. Wine lasts for years. Cabbage wilts in weeks. Sauerkraut survives winters. Milk spoils by afternoon. Cheese endures seasons. Fermentation bent time itself. Modern reflections remind us how enduring this is. We still drink wine, eat cheese, spread miso. We call it cuisine now. Not survival, but the roots remain visible. Kombucha bottles on supermarket shelves. Craft breweries producing endless varieties. Artisans fermenting vegetables not because they must, but because they choose to. Flavor has outlasted necessity. Yet even in our kitchens, fermentation carries echoes of its old function. Sourdough bread with its tangy starter. Yogurt with its live cultures. Soy sauce splashed on a meal. All are fragments of the ancient contract with microbes. Living preservation alive inside every bite. Fermentation also reveals something deeper about humanity. A willingness to risk. To let food change. To embrace smells and tastes that seem strange at first. To believe that transformation could be safe, even beneficial. It was not the instinctive path. Rotting food is dangerous. Yet people discovered which rots could be trusted, and built entire cuisines around them. This trust was powerful. Fermentation allowed armies to march with cheese and wine, sailors to travel with pickled vegetables, farmers to endure hungry seasons, and cities to flourish with breweries and bakeries at their center. Fermented foods were not just preserved. They were portable, shareable, and profitable. By the 19th century, science caught up with tradition. Louis Pasteur revealed the role of microbes in fermentation. What had been mystery became microbiology. Yet the practice itself needed no microscope. People had been living with it for thousands of years already. His discoveries only confirmed what taste and time had long taught. And still today, fermentation stands apart from mechanical refrigeration. Because it does not merely hold food still. It changes it, deepens it, creates flavors machines cannot. Fridges may keep milk cold, but only bacteria can make it cheese. Freezers may hold grapes firm, but only yeast can turn them into wine. Fermentation is not just a pause. It is a metamorphosis. And in that metamorphosis humans found one of the most reliable, and perhaps most beautiful, ways to outwit hunger. From here our story will move into other kinds of transformation. Methods that dry, methods that sweeten, methods that seal. But fermentation remains the strangest chapter. A reminder that sometimes survival comes not from resisting nature, but from partnering with it, inviting change in order to endure. After salt, after smoke, after cellars and caves, another ally emerged. One that seemed at first more luxury than necessity. Sweetness. Honey was the first. Bees gathering nectar. Humans gathering honeycombs. The thick golden liquid was more than flavor. It was protection. Honey is naturally antimicrobial. Its high sugar content draws water away from bacteria, starving them. Its acidity too sharp for most organisms to survive. Jars of honey have been found in Egyptian tombs, still edible thousands of years later, not by accident, but by design of nature itself. Early peoples learned quickly. Meat coated in honey lasted longer. Fruits submerged in it remained safe. Medicines too were mixed with honey not just for taste, but for endurance. It was both preservative and healing balm. Smeared on wounds, spooned into jars of herbs. Honey was sweetness turned into shield. In Greece and Rome honey preservation was common. Fish dipped in honey and vinegar. Fruits boiled in honey syrup. Cakes soaked in it to endure longer. For wealthy households honey was abundance and pleasure, but also insurance against waste. Before sugar plantations, honey was the sweetest weapon against decay. Then came sugar. Extracted first from cane in India, spread through Persia, carried into the Mediterranean by Arab traders. By the Middle Ages sugar was both medicine and rarity in Europe, sold by the ounce in apothecaries, used to preserve fruits. A handful of cherries boiled in sugar syrup could last far beyond their season. Apples candied, citrons glazed, ginger crystallized, sweets for kings and courts. Preservation that tasted like luxury. As sugar production grew, so did its role in preservation. In the Caribbean plantations, in colonial trade, sugar became abundant, and with it new techniques. Jam, jelly, marmalade, fruits boiled with sugar until the mixture thickened, sealed in jars, bright flavors locked in time, a spoonful of summer kept for winter mornings. This was not only practical, it was delightful. Sugar preserved vitamins as salt did not, and unlike smoke or brine, it offered joy in every bite. Children with sticky fingers, families savoring rare sweetness in lean months, the preservation of pleasure as much as survival. Candied fruits carried symbolism too. In medieval Europe, a gift of sugared almonds or preserved oranges was not just food, but a statement of wealth. To preserve something in sugar was to announce that you could afford the ingredient itself. In some cases the sugar cost more than the fruit. A strange inversion where the preservative was more precious than what it protected. Honey meanwhile never vanished. Monks in Europe still tended hives. Apothecaries still bottled it. Folk remedies still mixed it with herbs. And in some regions honey remained the chief sweetener long after sugar spread elsewhere. In Russia mead was drunk. In Ethiopia honey wine brewed. In the Middle East honey preserved nuts in sticky blocks of halva. Each culture twisting sweetness into endurance in its own way. Think too of candied flowers. Violets sugared in France. Rose petals preserved in syrup. Delicate, fleeting things given months of life by sugar's grip. Preservation not just for hunger, but for beauty. An edible memory of spring. Modern reflections show how this legacy persists. Jars of jam in pantries. Marmalade on toast. Fruitcakes at holidays. We think of them as treats, not as survival. Yet they are echoes of preservation. Ways to hold fruit beyond its season. To spread strawberries on bread in January. To unwrap candied citrus in midwinter. Luxury has become ordinary. Yet its origins were desperate ingenuity. Sugar also shaped global history. Plantations in the Caribbean. Slavery and trade. Entire empires built on sweetness. And with them preservation methods spread and standardized. What began as medicine and rarity became staple and tradition. Though its legacy carries both delight and shadow, honey still carries its ancient aura. Marketed as pure, natural, enduring. A spoonful stirred into tea. A drizzle over bread. Perhaps unconsciously we still sense its old role. Not just sweet, but protective. Food that defies time. The difference between sugar and salt is telling. Salt preserves by drawing moisture out, leaving food stark and brined. Sugar preserves by drawing water too, but leaves behind brightness, color, a sense of indulgence. Two opposite paths, both saving food from ruin. One with austerity, the other with pleasure. Today we often seek less sugar. We speak of health. We avoid sweets. Yet the memory of its power lingers. In candied fruits sold at markets. In jams still boiled each summer by home cooks. In wedding cakes layered with marzipan. All traditions tied to preservation as much as celebration. Sweetness as shield was never the only path. But it was one of the most beloved. A preservation that became art. From jars of honey sealed in pharaohs' tombs. To sugared violets in Parisian shops. To jam on a winter's morning. The story is the same. Sugar stretches life, and in stretching life, gives us pleasure. As our journey continues, we turn to yet another shield. Not sweetness, not salt, but fat. Oils poured over cheese. Meat sealed in butter or lard. Confit simmered and stored beneath a rich layer of fat. Preservation through sealing. A lid not of glass, but of grease. A different kind of armor against time. We have wandered through salt and smoke, through cellars and caves, through sweetness spun from bees and cane. But another method remained closer to the body itself. Fat. Fat was not only fuel for survival. It was also a shield. Thick, opaque, impenetrable to air. And air is what most food fears. Oxygen feeds bacteria. Mold thrives where air can touch. But cover something in fat. And time slows. The simplest example is confit. Born in France. Duck or goose meat simmered gently in its own fat. Until tender. Then packed into earthenware pots. And sealed beneath the same fat. Cooled and stored for months. A method both practical and delicious. A farmer's winter pantry. And later a gourmet's treasure. This logic appeared in many places. Not just France. In medieval England meat was potted, cooked and pressed into jars, covered with clarified butter to keep air away, a layer of yellow sealing in protein, an edible lid against spoilage. In Germany schmaltz preserved meats. In Spain olive oil encased cheeses and sausages. In North Africa olive oil poured over vegetables, garlic and lemon, locking them in safety. The world discovered again and again that fat was barrier as well as nourishment. Fat also preserved dairy itself. Butter stored in crocks and sealed with brine or wax. Ghee in India clarified until it no longer spoiled. Its water and proteins removed, leaving pure fat that lasted for months, sometimes years. This was not only preservation but portability. A herder could carry ghee across deserts. A family could keep butter safe without ice. Golden endurance in a jar. There is a logic here. Fat does not welcome water. And water is what microbes need. So by submerging food in fat, you deny them their playground. It is crude chemistry practiced long before chemistry had a name. Peasants as well as nobles relied on this. A pot of meat beneath lard meant protein deep into winter. A wheel of cheese bathed in oil meant flavor through lean months. It was not luxury alone, but necessity. Because when the last apples withered, when the last cabbages rotted, there still might be a sealed jar waiting quietly beneath a crust of fat. Of course, it was not foolproof. Sometimes jars went rancid. Sometimes seals broke. Sometimes what was meant to preserve turned foul. But often enough it worked. Enough to keep families alive. Enough to make it tradition. There is also symbolism here. Fat is the essence of plenty, the rich part of an animal or crop. To preserve with fat is to preserve with abundance. To use richness as armor. Survival layered in luxury. In the Mediterranean, olive oil was both food and preservative. Olives pressed into golden liquid, poured over vegetables, herbs, even fish, stopping air, holding freshness. Jars of oil with garlic or peppers became staples. Flavors deepened. Time was postponed. In some monasteries, cheeses were submerged in oil, pulled months later with softened rinds and intensified taste. Again, preservation crossing into refinement. Modern reflections remind us that this tradition never vanished. Confit still cooked in French kitchens. Ghee still spread across Indian meals. Olive oil still poured over preserved tomatoes and peppers. And in the rise of artisanal food, jars of vegetables sealed in oil-line markets. Less about survival now, more about flavor and craft. Yet always echoing the old need. Fat preservation also taught us something about sealing in general. If you cover food, if you block oxygen, you can win against decay. It was a principle that would later be perfected in canning. But here, long before glass jars and tin lids, it was achieved with butter, with oil, with lard. Imagine a medieval winter larder. Crocks of meat capped with congealed fat. Small pots of butter clarified and stored. Baskets of olives swimming in their own pressed oil. Nothing extravagant. Just insurance. Insurance against hunger. Against famine. Against the long uncertainty of seasons. Today we refrigerate and freeze. We vacuum seal. We rely on machines to guard our food. Yet fat remains a quiet partner. A drizzle of oil over pesto to keep it bright. A seal of butter atop pâté. A jar of sun-dried tomatoes resting in oil. Methods older than nations. Still used. Still trusted. The continuity is striking. A line from a medieval cook pouring butter over salted beef, to a modern cook covering hummus with oil in a plastic tub. Centuries apart. The same logic. Keep the air away, and you keep the food. From fat we move toward more deliberate sealing. Into jars. Into cans. Into methods born not of nature but of invention. For human ingenuity never rested on salt and fat alone. It reached for fire, for glass, for metal, for chemistry. A revolution of preservation that reshaped the world. But before we arrive there, it is worth pausing to remember that not every survival technique was austere. Sometimes it was indulgent. Sometimes the very substance of luxury became shield against hunger. A pot of duck confit. A jar of olives in golden oil. A block of butter clarified into ghee. All reminders that preservation could taste like wealth. And taste like life. We have seen food buried in earth. Sealed in fat. Hidden in sweetness. But another shield against decay was liquid. Fermented. Sharp. And sometimes intoxicating. Alcohol came first. Not as a preservation method on its own, but as the natural companion of fermentation. When grapes turned to wine, or barley to beer, not only did new flavors appear, but safety. For bacteria and parasites struggled in alcohol. Wine stored water more safely than rivers. Beer fed medieval towns when wells were foul. A cup of alcohol was not just leisure. It was insurance. Soon people saw that alcohol could preserve more than itself. Fruit suspended in brandy. Cherries steeped in liqueur. Pears bottled in wine. These lasted long after fresh fruit vanished from the orchard. Sweetness of summer carried into dark winters. Not by drying or salting, but by soaking in spirits. In England, branded fruits filled pantries. In France, pears were bottled in clear jars of eau-de-vie. Liqueurs themselves began as ways to preserve herbs. Monks steeping leaves and flowers in alcohol, creating tonics that kept their strength long after harvest. Medicine and preservation intertwined. A handful of mint became fleeting, but a bottle of mint liqueur endured. Vinegar offered another path. a byproduct of wine gone sour. It too resisted decay, acid too sharp for microbes to thrive. And so vinegar became preservation for vegetables. Cucumbers turned to pickles. Onions submerged in brine and vinegar. Radishes sealed away in jars. In India, mangoes pickled with spices. In Korea, radish and garlic. In Japan, yum plums salted and soured into umeboshi. Vinegar carried food across continents and seasons. Pickling was not merely survival. It became culture. The crisp tang of sauerkraut in Germany. The sour punch of kimchi in Korea. The sweet-sour chutneys of South Asia. The sharp olives of the Mediterranean. Each culture embraced vinegar and brine not just for endurance, but for taste. The appetite for sharpness became tradition. On ships, vinegar became necessity. Barrels of pickled vegetables traveled across oceans, preventing scurvy, feeding sailors with the vitamins fresh produce could no longer give. Without pickling, exploration would have been shorter, voyages hungrier, empires smaller. Alcohol and vinegar also shaped ritual. Wine in sacred feasts, vinegar in cleansing rites. Both were more than preservers. They became symbols. Life and sourness, celebration and austerity. Their presence in kitchens and temples intertwined. Modern reflections show how strong this legacy remains. Pickles still line supermarket shelves. Jam may be sweet indulgence, but pickles are daily staple. On burgers, in lunches, in family recipes. Vinegar remains trusted. A splash in dressings. A seal for canned vegetables. A preservative older than our governments. Still on every table. Alcohol too carries its ancient role quietly, not only in glasses raised at meals, but in extracts. Vanilla suspended in spirits. Tinctures of herbs. Fruitcakes laced with brandy to last through holidays. Traditions we call festive now, but which began as insurance against time. The science became clear later. Vinegar's acidity drops pH, blocking bacterial growth. Alcohol denatures proteins, disrupts microbes. Yet people used them long before knowing how, trusting taste and trial instead of microscopes. Centuries of patience proving what science later explained. Imagine a medieval kitchen. A crock of pickles resting by the hearth. A jar of fruit glowing in syrup and brandy. Each one a promise that hunger would not strike too quickly. Each one a small experiment in chemistry, conducted without knowing the word. Compare it to our kitchens today. A jar of olives in brine. A bottle of vanilla extract. A cupboard with balsamic vinegar and apple cider vinegar. The continuity is almost invisible. We think of them as flavorings. Yet they are fragments of an old battle. Against time. Against rot. Alcohol and vinegar bridged survival and pleasure. No longer was preservation always austere. These methods added brightness, bite, even intoxication. What kept food safe also made it joyful. And so we see a pattern again. The preservative becoming culture. The shield becoming flavor. The necessity becoming indulgence. From here our story bends once more. Into invention. Into sealing food not just with fat or vinegar, but with fire and glass. Canning and bottling. A 19th century revolution. The beginning of preservation as industry. The ancestor of tins stacked in pantries today. But before we move there, let us stay with the image of a jar. A pear suspended in brandy. A cucumber in vinegar. Two different liquids. Two different fates. Both transforming fragility into endurance. Both turning fleeting harvest into memory. Stored in glass. Waiting patiently for the hand that will open them. By now we have seen food preserved with salt and smoke. Buried in earth. Sealed in fat. Pickled in vinegar. Soaked in spirits. Each method rooted in centuries of slow refinement. But in the 19th century something new arrived. A revolution that promised food sealed not by nature, but by industry. The story begins with war. Napoleon Bonaparte needed an army that could march far, fight long, and not starve when supply lines stretched thin. Traditional methods could only carry soldiers so far. Salted meat grew wearying. Hardtack crumbled. Fresh food spoiled. So the French government offered a prize for anyone who could invent a new way to preserve food. The winner was Nicolas Appert, a confectioner by trade. Not a scientist, not a soldier, but a man with curiosity and patience. He discovered that food sealed in glass jars, then heated in boiling water, could remain safe for months, sometimes even years. He did not know why. No one knew yet about microbes, but he knew it worked. He built a factory, and in 1810 published his methods, laying the foundation for canning. Soon metal joined glass. Tin-coated iron sheets pressed into cylinders, lighter and sturdier than fragile jars. Peter Durand patented the tin can in Britain, a technology quickly adopted for navies and explorers. Though at first the cans were thick and heavy, opened with hammer and chisel more than a key, still they carried peas across oceans, beef across continents, entire meals through deserts and seas. This was preservation elevated to empire. The British Navy carried canned rations. Polar explorers survived on tins of soup and meat. Armies in Crimea and later in the American Civil War ate food sealed in factories thousands of miles away. Canning made food mobile in a new sense, not just across seasons, but across continents. The science lagged behind the practice. Louis Pasteur's discoveries in the 1860s finally explained why it worked. Heating killed microorganisms. Sealing kept them out. Appert's method had been correct all along. Though he had spoken only of driving out the air, now the invisible enemy had a name: bacteria. And the invisible war had a strategy: sterilization. At home the process seeped into daily life. Women preserved peaches in glass mason jars. Invented in 1858 with a screw-top lid that sealed tight. Canning fruits and vegetables became summer ritual. Families stacking shelves with jars glowing like stained glass. Cherries, beans, tomatoes, each one a memory of summer carried into January. A continuation of ancient storage practices, but with new precision. Canning transformed diets. Peas and corn no longer vanished in winter. Tomatoes could appear on tables year-round. For the first time the rhythm of eating began to break free from the rhythm of seasons. A hint of the global abundance we take for granted now. Yet the new technology was not flawless. Early cans sometimes leaked lead from solder. Workers labored in hot, dangerous factories. Explorers died from poorly sealed tins. Canning was powerful but imperfect. Like every leap it carried its own risks. Still it spread relentlessly. By the late 19th century cities across Europe and America built canning plants. Industrial scale feeding industrial populations. Railroads carried canned goods to distant towns. Steamships exported them across oceans. A world of trade and empire woven not just from cotton or coal, but from food sealed in tin. Canning reshaped culture too. Advertisements promised housewives ease. Recipes began to include canned pineapple, canned milk, canned soups. Foods once exotic became staples. Hawaiian fruit in New York kitchens. Italian tomatoes in English stews. The geography of food bent into new shapes. Even art noticed. Andy Warhol's soup can centuries later. A pop echo of how deeply canned goods had entered daily life. When packaging became as iconic as the food itself. And yet through all this the ritual of home canning endured. Families continued to gather in kitchens, boiling jars, filling them with fruit or jam, lining cellars with orderly rows. An act both modern and ancient. Science wrapped around tradition. Domestic life blending with industrial discovery. Today the practice persists. Though supermarkets line shelves with endless options. Canned beans, canned fish, canned soups. We still trust the tin. We still trust the jar. Appert's legacy remains as close as our cupboards. Science has refined it further. Pressure canners ensuring complete sterilization. Standards ensuring safety. The modern factory a far cry from Appert's kitchen. Yet the principle remains unchanged. Heat and seal. Protect from microbes. Stop time for just a while. Modern reflections remind us of the paradox. We think of canned food as ordinary, even unremarkable. But for centuries it was unthinkable. Peas in February, pineapple in December, beef still edible months after slaughter. Luxuries once reserved for kings became common for workers. Canning helped democratize abundance. Still some resist, preferring fresh, suspicious of tins, complaining of metallic taste, forgetting that without cans whole centuries lived more precariously. We complain from comfort, a comfort earned through sealed lids and boiling pots. Imagine again the contrast. A medieval sailor with barrels of salted meat crawling with maggots. A Victorian sailor with tins of beef sealed tight. A difference not just of food, but of morale, of survival itself. So as we line up our tins of beans, our jars of tomato paste, our cans of condensed milk, we are holding fragments of that 19th century revolution, a quiet technology, born from war, adopted by empires, embraced by homes, and still shaping how we eat. And yet, our journey does not stop here. For after canning came freezing. Not natural ice alone, but machines that could summon winter at will. Refrigeration redefined food in the 20th century. Another leap, from sealed tins to chilled aisles, from preservation to convenience. But before stepping into that cold domain, pause with the image of a mason jar, sealed tight with peaches glowing inside, or a tin of soup waiting on a shelf. Silent, ordinary, but revolutionary, a container of time, waiting to be opened. For thousands of years cold was a gift, or a burden, depending on where you lived. In northern winters food froze naturally, fish stiff as boards on riverbanks, meat hardened in snow, grains and apples stored in frosty barns. Cold preserved not through ingenuity but through climate. Nature giving its own storage free of charge. Yet this gift was uneven. In hot regions cold was rare, a luxury found only on mountain peaks, or in ice carried at great expense. Persian engineers built yakhals, massive domed structures with underground chambers, storing ice brought from mountains in winter, to chill drinks in scorching summers. Mughal emperors in India paid men to run blocks of Himalayan ice to their palaces. The ice traveled faster than armies, melting as it went, arriving as precious as silver. In Europe ice houses became status symbols. Brick chambers buried underground, lined with straw, holding frozen lakes harvested in January. Aristocrats dined in July on chilled desserts, while peasants sweated in fields without relief. Cold was not yet democratic. It was a privilege. In the 18th and 19th centuries that began to change. The ice trade grew into industry. In New England men carved frozen lakes into massive blocks, hauled them by horse, loaded them into ships, and sent them to the Caribbean, to India, to Australia. A global commerce in frozen water. Thousands of miles of sea carrying nothing but silence and frost. Wealth built on the fragility of ice, wrapped in sawdust, stored in warehouses. A short-lived empire of winter. But the true revolution arrived when people no longer had to chase ice. They could make it. Artificial refrigeration began with experiments in chemistry. Early machines in the mid-19th century used compression and expansion of gases to create cooling. Bulky, dangerous, often leaky, but enough to prove it possible. Enough to show that cold could be manufactured. Breweries were among the first to adopt it. Beer required steady, cool temperatures. So German brewers in America led the way, installing refrigeration machines to keep their lager fresh. Meat packers followed. Rail cars fitted with cooling systems carried beef across states. Cold transformed trade. Distances shrank. Seasons loosened. By the early 20th century, refrigeration entered homes. At first not by machine but by the icebox, a wooden cabinet lined with tin. A large block of ice slid into the top compartment, slowly melting, keeping food below cool. Icemen delivered fresh blocks daily. The clink of ice tongs a familiar sound in city streets. A service industry built on melting time. Only later did mechanical refrigerators shrink into kitchens. In the 1920s and 1930s, electric models appeared. Their humming motors and small freezer compartment symbols of modernity. Advertisements promised housewives freedom from daily shopping. Milk could last days. Meat a week. Leftovers preserved without salt or vinegar. The rhythms of cooking and shopping changed. Life itself changed. Freezing food became possible too. Clarence Birdseye, inspired by Inuit practices of flash freezing fish in Arctic air, developed methods to freeze food quickly at industrial scale. Frozen peas. Frozen spinach. Frozen fillets of fish. Once thawed, they tasted close to fresh. A marvel to those who remembered wrinkled pickles and salted beef. The frozen aisle was born. Supermarkets built themselves around it. Bright cabinets glowing with packages. Food frozen at the moment of harvest. Transported across oceans. Waiting months until bought. A triumph of technology over time. Yet cold reshaped more than meals. It reshaped memory. Before refrigeration, food was bound to seasons. Strawberries in June. Apples in autumn. Root cellars in winter. With freezers, seasons blurred. Strawberries in December. Peas in February. A timeless diet that no human before had known. Modern reflections show both gratitude and distance. We no longer marvel at frozen corn. We frown when ice cream softens too quickly. We expect our milk to last. Our leftovers to remain. Forgetting how recently this became possible. Still echoes of the old ways remain. In artisanal pickles. In jams simmered in kitchens. In smoked meats hanging in butcher shops. Not because we need them now, but because we remember through taste. That preservation was once labor. And flavor was born from necessity. And so refrigeration joined the long story of human endurance. Not replacing every old method, but layering itself among them. A machine hum added to the chorus of salt, smoke, sugar, fat, vinegar, and ice. To imagine life before refrigerators is to imagine vigilance. Shopping daily, cooking immediately, trusting senses to know when food was turning, living close to decay. And to imagine life with refrigerators is to imagine leisure, distance from markets, confidence in tomorrow's meals, a widening of time itself. The cold has become ordinary, but it was once extraordinary, a miracle carried by ships from New England lakes, a prize dragged from Himalayan peaks, a dome of ice in a Persian desert, now summoned with a button, a hum behind a kitchen door. And so our journey nears its close. From salt mines to freezers. From smokehouses to humming compressors. From jars sealed in boiling water. To frozen packets glowing under supermarket lights. We see continuity. We see transformation. But even now new methods appear. Vacuum sealing. Freeze drying. Packaging that preserves not just taste, but texture and nutrients. A 21st century refinement of ancient goals. Yet the heart of it remains the same. Humans wrestling with time. Trying to hold the fleeting. Trying to taste again what once was fresh. Preservation not only of food, but of memory, of security, of life. We have walked slowly through the centuries. Watched smoke curl around hams. Salt bury fish in heavy crystals. Honey pour thick over fruit. Fat seal meat in jars. Vinegar sour cucumbers into pickles. Wine cradle cherries in its warmth. Glass jars boiling in aperts pots. Tins stacked in ships' holds. Ice carved from lakes. Machines humming behind kitchen doors. Together these methods form a single thread. A human attempt to keep time from swallowing what we grow. Preserving food was never only about eating. It was about survival. A hedge against hunger in winter. A safeguard in journeys. A promise that children would not go unfed. It was also about community. Gathering in kitchens to smoke meat. Harvest days spent salting fish. Families working together over boiling pots. Rituals repeated season after season. The rhythm of preservation shaping the rhythm of life. But food preservation was also about power. Those who could store food held advantage. Armies marched farther. Sailors survived longer. Empires extended reach. The British Navy fed by pickles. Napoleon's troops supplied by tins. Polar expeditions carried by barrels of preserved meat. Preservation extended not only lifespans but influence. To preserve food was to preserve strength. And still, preservation carried culture. A sourness for sauerkraut in Germany. A heat for kimchi in Korea. A sweetness for candied fruit in Persia. A smokiness for hams in Spain. Flavors born not of whim, but of necessity, yet loved so much they became tradition. We keep them today not because we must, but because they remind us of who we were. Modern reflections make the contrast clear. We open a refrigerator without thought. Choose between frozen peas and fresh. Pick jars of olives or jam from supermarket aisles. Without fear of famine. Without dread of spoilage. Our worries now are different. Too much food. Not too little. Waste instead of want. A reversal of the anxieties that shaped our ancestors' lives. And yet, our bodies still crave the flavors of preservation. The tang of pickles. The sweetness of jam. The smoke in bacon. Our tongues carry memory. Our appetites remember. What once was survival now tastes like comfort. Think of how far the story stretches. A Neolithic farmer drying grain in the sun. A Persian laborer storing ice in a desert dome. A French confectioner sealing peas in glass. A New England iceman shouldering a block of winter. A housewife in 1930 opening a humming refrigerator. All linked by the same quiet desire. To keep food longer than it wished to last. Perhaps preservation is also about more than food. It is about holding on. We salt memories as much as meat. We pickle experiences in jars of story. We freeze moments in photographs. We preserve against time itself, knowing we cannot stop it, but hoping to delay its work, just long enough. And so our long walk ends. From salt to smoke, vinegar to brandy, tins to freezers. Each step an invention. Each invention a reflection of fear and hope. Fear of hunger. Hope for tomorrow. As you listen, perhaps with your own refrigerator humming softly nearby, remember that hum is history. It carries voices of fishermen salting cod in Iceland, families drying figs on Mediterranean rooftops, brewers carving ice in winter ponds, scientists sealing jars in boiling water. A single quiet sound linked to centuries of effort. In the end, food preservation tells us a simple truth. To eat is to live. To preserve is to plan. And in planning, we have built civilizations. So when you spread jam on bread, when you fork a pickle from a jar, when you open a can of soup, or pull frozen peas from the freezer, you are tasting centuries of invention. Flavors layered with survival. Memories preserved in salt. Stories sealed under wax. The methods have changed. The need remains. And so does the quiet poetry of preservation. Humans against decay. Time delayed in jars. Winter softened with sweetness. Summer extended with brine. A history stored. And still unfolding.